All right, for the next few minutes, let's just set aside the civics textbook version of democracy we all learned. Instead, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to take a look under the hood, at the actual machinery of power, the systems of social control that are humming along right beneath the surface of our political lives.
So let's start with a really basic question, one we think we know the answer to. We're always told that an election is our chance to choose, a tool for us to shape our future. But what if that's not its main job? What if its primary function isn't about empowering us, but about managing us? What if the vote is less a lever of change and more of a thermostat for the whole system? Here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at elections as a way to handle social pressure. Then, we'll get into the psychology of what it means to be a voter in that system. After that, we'll examine the built-in rules that pretty much any leader has to follow once they're in office. And finally, we'll reframe our whole understanding of democracy, not as an ideal, but as a really, really effective piece of technology for keeping things stable. Okay, so the first big idea we need to get our heads around is what some political scientists call the pressure cooker model of elections. And the thinking here is that the whole point of an election isn't really to do what the public wants, but to channel and basically neutralize public anger.
Now, at the heart of this model is something called the safety valve theory. I want you to picture all of a nation's frustration, with the economy, with politics, with social problems, as steam building up inside a giant, sealed pressure cooker. In a dictatorship, that pressure just builds and builds and builds until, boom, revolution. But a democracy? Well, a democracy has a nifty little release valve built right in. And the process works in a pretty predictable cycle. First, the pressure builds. People get fed up. They accumulate this emotional debt. Then comes the election. That's the release valve. It gives the entire population a way to channel all that anger into one single nonviolent act, voting the bums out. And the result? A huge collective sigh of relief. The system cools down, the danger of a real revolt just kind of melts away, and the status quo is safe to start the whole cycle over again.
So if that's the main function of an election at the systemic level, it has some really deep psychological effects on us as individual voters. I mean, if the real point is just to let off steam, what does that say about our own sense of making a difference? This brings us to the fascinating link between participation and control.
You see, we're basically living with two competing stories. The first one is the dream, the civic ideal. Our vote is our power, and we can use it to make fundamental changes. But the second story, the one this theory puts forward, is that our participation is really just a way to get our buy-in. See, by making us feel like we have ownership, the system makes sure that when things go wrong, we don't blame the system itself. Instead, the blame gets shot sideways. We blame our neighbors for voting the wrong way. And that infighting, it's the perfect way to make sure no one ever mounts a unified challenge to the structure itself.
This whole idea is captured in one perfect, incredibly sharp sentence. You are less likely to burn down a building if you believe you own the deed to it. And that right there is the core of what's called manufactured consent. The feeling of control, the illusion of ownership, is an incredibly powerful tool for keeping people calm. If you feel like you have a stake in the system, even a symbolic one, you're invested in keeping it stable, not tearing it down.
So if our power as voters is constrained, what about the people we elect? Surely a brand new leader with a bold new vision can really shake things up, right? Well, according to this theory, not so fast. The problem isn't the person, it's the institution. The office itself has rules. Here's the central point. The office changes the person way more than the person changes the office. To survive and actually govern, any leader, it doesn't matter what they promised on the campaign trail, has to keep the permanent pillars of the state happy. We're talking about the military, the big financial players, and the massive entrenched bureaucracy. The number one job becomes keeping the system itself running. And that priority often pushes personal beliefs and popular demands to the back burner.
And what this creates is a really powerful selection bias. The arena of power itself basically works like a giant filter. Anyone who isn't willing to make those tough compromises or engage in the messy, sometimes morally gray business of governing, well, they get filtered out long before they ever get near the top. So the system naturally selects for a certain kind of person, which leads to this surprising similarity among the elite, no matter what party they belong to.
And this all brings us to our final and maybe most critical way of looking at all this. If elections are just for managing dissent and leaders are boxed in by the system they inherit, then what is the ultimate point of democracy? Well, the answer lies in seeing it not as a moral philosophy, but as a superior kind of social technology.
Think about the age-old problem of transferring power. Back in the day, when a king died, what happened?
often a bloody succession crisis. War was how you decided who was next. Now, compare that to the democratic way, a predictable, structured, and, this is the key, non-violent process. From this perspective, democracy is simply the technology that allows us to count heads instead of breaking them. It's a civil war without the bloodshed.
And you really can't overstate how important this invention is. The entire modern global economy is built on stability and predictability. Violent, chaotic power struggles are just terrible for business and long-term investment. Democracy provides a kind of security protocol, a clean, efficient way to change leadership without burning the whole house down.
So, all of this culminates in a classic political science idea, the Pareto principle of elites. The theory basically says that history is just a graveyard of aristocracies. The faces change, the slogans change, the parties change their names, but the basic structure, a small, organized group that rules, and a large, disorganized group that is ruled, that stays the same.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question. If this theory of power holds any water, what are we really doing on Election Day? Are we charting a bold new course for our country, or are we simply choosing the next set of caretakers for a system that's designed to keep on running no matter who happens to be sitting in the big chair?